But we're kicking off with the European Central Bank, which has announced its first interest rate increase in almost 3 years, raising its benchmark rate as it seeks to tackle rising inflation across the eurozone. The move comes amid growing concerns over the impact of the conflict in the Middle East on global energy prices and the wider economy, and it's a decision that will have real consequences for mortgage holders, savers and households already facing cost of living pressures. To help us understand what this latest ECB decision means for Ireland and what could lie ahead for borrowers and the wider economy, I'm joined on the line now by the Ennis native and Assistant Professor of Social Policy at UCD, Micheál Collins. Micheál, a very good morning to you.
Alan, good morning.
Thanks very much for being with us. So can you maybe explain a little further, Micheál, the significance of this decision?
Yeah, I suppose, Alan, this is a kind of slow step forward by the European Central Bank and almost a repeat of history, in that they did this exactly a couple of years ago when we had our kind of last experience of inflation coming associated with the Ukraine invasion. And they're kind of sending signals by pushing up the interest rate just in a very small way to say we're worried about prices increasing, about inflation, and the impact, as you said, that's having on the living standards of people. And we might come back to why that's a problem in a second. And they said, OK, we're going to sort of make our first move now. We're going to watch things and see how that develops over the next couple of months. And of course, as you'll see indeed from the news this morning, you know, the uncertainty in the Middle East, which is really at the root of all of this inflation burst, continues. And that if that continues and persists over the next couple of months, well, they'll continue to slowly push up the inflation rate. And why they're doing that, so the economics of it is simply to try and take a bit of heat and a bit of money out of the economy, to decrease spending, to slow things down a bit, and to take some of the impetus that's there for prices to rise out of the economy and slow things down. So this is their tool to do that. First step forward, but perhaps depending on Donald Trump, depending on the Middle East, those are kind of difficult things to depend on, to be honest. It may be a process, or the Middle East issues may resolve themselves and it might be something that kind of disappears again later in the year. So uncertainty, the name of the game, but that's nothing new for us, Alan.
No, it really isn't. And as you well know, Micheál, the ECB has been criticised in the past for reacting too slowly to inflation, particularly after the pandemic. However, this latest rise in rates, I've seen disagreement among economists. Some warning it could be a policy mistake. Can you see arguments on both sides of the debate on this one, or are you very much entrenched in this is a sensible move from the ECB camp?
Yeah, I think it's why it's so small, Alan. So it's 0.25%. So that's small, and you'll see kind of the various calculations that have been done. It depends whether you're a borrower or a saver. For borrowers, be it households with mortgages, be it households with loans from financial institutions, be it businesses who borrow money for day-to-day cash flow issues or for investment, they're all going to see their rates go up just by a small amount. It's about an extra €12 a month for a borrower who per 100,000 that they've borrowed. So that's significant, obviously, as it adds up across a year. But it's small in the context of potentially what they could do. So I think this is a signal for them to do that. There's a logic to it, Alan. And so as an economist, it's the correct path for central banks to follow. And what they are trying to do is to try and put some brakes on inflation. And, that always seems like a kind of a distant thing to most of us. But really, if we look at what the CSO will tell us at the moment, they'll tell us that prices are increasing by, somewhere between 3 and 4% a year at the moment, all of which, of course, we'll notice as we walk into our supermarkets or buy fuel or, live our day-to-day lives. But at the same time, people's wages for those who are working, people's welfare payments and pensions for those who are retired and so on, they're increasing by an awful lot less, maybe 2% or something like that. So when you put the two of those things together, everybody in the country is worse off today than they were a year ago. Our buying power is lower. We might have a bit more money in our pockets, but it buys less, as everybody will notice in their day-to-day lives. And if that keeps going, it decreases the living standards of people. When we lived through that over the last couple of years, the impact of the increase in fuel prices and the other wave of inflation that came from the Ukraine invasion. People probably ended up with their wages and with their welfare payments and their pensions and so on going up by in and around 10% over that period. But prices went up 15-20%. All of us are worse off today than we were a few years ago, and that process continues. So the ECB are trying to take a bit of pressure off the system to slow that down, which in the long term is in the better interest of society. That's their remit to think about it in the longer term.
You people listening, Micheál, the average household around the county will be wondering, what the practical impact of this rate increase will be on them. You mentioned for borrowers earlier the €12 increase, and we know around 100 to 130,000 tracker mortgage holders in the country will feel the effects straight away. How significant will the increase be for those families already dealing with rising living costs? And that's that's the tracker mortgages. What about those on variable rate mortgages? Are those coming to the end of fixed rate deals? Should they be concerned about further increases?
Yeah, the flow through is slow enough. So obviously immediately for those tracker mortgages. So tracker mortgages are people who borrowed money generally in the run up to the big financial crash in this country in the kind of, almost 2 decades ago at this stage. And so those are people who, whose mortgages are immediately linked to the ECB rates. And so they will immediately see an increase. The vast majority of at least households who are borrowing money are on, for mortgages, are on fixed rates. And every so often they've got to renew those. It could be 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. And when they do that, they'll roll on now to a higher rate. So I suppose the feed through for households who have mortgages and borrowing will take, for some group it's immediate, but for others it'll take a while to unfold over the next while. People who have loans, we'll see the loans go up pretty rapidly. Could be personal loans and other loans, they'll go up pretty rapidly. Businesses will see the increases happen too. I was intrigued on the other side of the ledger, Alan, to see last night that I got a message from the Revolut Bank, where I happen to have their app on my phone, as I know many people do, and they said they are now paying a higher rate to savers. So they're implementing it overnight now. Generally, our banks are very slow at doing that and very slow at passing on the increases to people who are saving for higher interest rates. That's interesting, reflecting maybe a change in the competition in banking markets for that. It'll be interesting to see if AIB and Bank of Ireland and PTSB and the others follow rapidly. They tend to be good at pushing up rates, but not very good at pushing it up for savers. So it depends who you are, and there'll be a feed through. But I suppose it sits in the context then of those, really much more pronounced effects for the living standards for households, which is that we're all exposed to these higher prices, and then that has a particularly pronounced effect for households on the lowest incomes who spend all of their money and who do not save and aren't in the position to save. And those households, have seen their living costs increase rapidly over time, over the last kind of year, or a bit of a year really, as this crisis and the energy costs have folded through. And it's really about hoping to try and put some brakes on that and protect people's living standards in the medium term. But again, we're back to this uncertainty. We don't know whether the Middle East issue will be resolved next week, and we have another signal from Donald Trump that it might, but of course we've had that signal multiple times at this stage, so one pays little attention to it, but it may, and if it does come to some resolution over the next while, you would think that generally prices will begin to ease off later in the year, and the ECB would be in a position to reverse that. Having said that, if it's the case that this continues, this will be the start of a process, and the start of a process of rates going up as they did a couple of years ago, when the ECB rate got up to about 4% during the most recent cost of living crisis linked to the Ukraine invasion. So they will go back there if they need to try, despite the impact it has on individuals and households and businesses, if they can kind of try and slow down inflation in some way.
I do wonder if the rising mortgage repayments could have a negative knock-on effect or impact, Micheál, on local businesses, be it around Ennis or Clare in the country indeed, and local economies in terms of the reduced spending, and whether that could have wider consequences for businesses and employment, depending on how long this situation goes on, of course, as you just
absolutely.
mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose really the macroeconomic logic of the European Central Bank is that that's what should happen, that it takes some of the money that's circulating in the economy out and slows that down. And indeed, as businesses will tell you around the county now, I would have thought there is, certainly my observation is that there is a bit of a slowdown happening anyway. And clearly that is reflected on the impact that people are experiencing from the big increase in prices on a day-to-day basis that they're having. People are being a bit more careful on their spending because of what they're experiencing and the uncertainty that they're experiencing on a week-to-week basis. So in a sense, yes, Alan, it will feed through to impact that. It will feed through to take a little bit out of the national and the local economies and try and slow things down a little bit. That's what they're trying to do, and absolutely that has consequences for individuals as well. We would be better off if we can get back to a place where we have lower levels of increases in prices. But I suppose in a sense then that comes back to our serious exposure still decades later, as it were, to energy and oil, and this comes back to perhaps the model that we have as societies, that when you have this major disruption just to one area, it feeds through to big impacts for you, me, and everybody else on our living standards. And perhaps kind of it's ringing an alarm bell for us that in the longer term we do need to think about a kind of a better way of being able to provide our energy in a way that's more sustainable and that protects all of us from these very difficult price increases that are folding through.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier on consequences for people, and a lot of people listening this morning will struggle to see the good intentions in this particular move, and I think it's exemplified by a message we've just received from one Morning Focus listener on 086 1800 964, and they're asking, how will increasing loan rates assist people in these difficult financial times? Which I suppose is a fair enough question, Micheál.
No, it is, absolutely, and it won't, I suppose, is the answer, and that it's really about slowing things down for the economy as a whole. I suppose it pushes things over to government, and we're about 4 months away from the budget as well, where governments will need to help some of the most vulnerable and most exposed individuals and households on foot of this. So, when we begin to think about our budget in October, I think we've kind of learned lessons, I hope, over the last couple of years, that the way to respond to some difficulties like this is not to give money to everybody, which has been our solution for the last couple of years, but rather to kind of give targeted support to different groups of individuals who are most exposed, be that the kind of short-term targeted reductions in the VAT on fuel, or some increases to the living alone allowance or the fuel allowance for certain groups as well. So the government needs to kind of think about that in the context of the budget, where you would attempt to offset some of the pain that absolutely, as that listener points out, some households are going to feel. But yeah, the macroeconomics of this is about taking some of the fuel out of the economy and slowing it down, the heat out of the economy and slowing it down a little bit. But good policy should protect those that are most exposed, and there's a focus then on the government to begin to do that. The danger would be that the government decides to help everybody, which of course brings us back to square one, and we'll just see prices continue to increase, and ultimately that decreases our living standards, which is a place we don't want to go.
Just finally, Micheál, the financial market's expecting at least 1 or 2 further rate increases over the coming year. Is that more likely than not?
It's likely, but this is entirely driven by the American-Israeli war in the Middle East. and the knock-on implications of that for fuel, which is then feeding across to everything else. And we know that that's pushing through price increases, and your listeners will be familiar already with the announcements from electricity companies and others that prices are going up. So sort of slowly those price increases are feeding through, and I think we can expect those to continue to feed through, as they have indeed for our groceries and everything else, over the next couple of months. So if we were still sitting here talking about that conflict in a couple of months' time, there's an inevitability that the increases will happen. If that begins to resolve, it will take some time for prices to drop back, and then slowly the European Central Bank would roll it back. I'd expect they'll be back for another small increase in a couple of months' time.
Okay, we will watch this space, but always appreciate you taking us through the ins and outs of it. Micheál, thanks as ever for joining us on Morning Focus.
Nice to talk to you, Alex.
Thank you. That's Assistant Professor of Social Policy at UCD, Ennis's Micheál Collins, with us on Morning Focus.